Hey class, this is going to be the 20 key events of Old Testament history. Now this is going to be really important for this unit, but also everything we're going to be doing for the rest of the year. I'm going to go through the 20 kind of greatest hits from Israel's history, starting with Abraham and ending right before Jesus. And the reason we're doing this is to give you kind of an overview, kind of a skeleton that you can hang some flesh on, a kind of a scaffolding that you can build something around, so you kind of know the arc of the story before we go through and read all the different stories. So we're going to start with an outline and then kind of fill in as we go through each story over the course of the next few months as we're going through the Old Testament. So these are the 20 key events I want you to know. You're going to have a quiz on this. I'm going to make you make flashcards. Also, you can get notes number 1 off of Edline or in class. We're going to be going through those. And it'll follow right along with this PowerPoint if you get notes page number 1. So let's go ahead and get to it. First of all, it's good. Let's talk about the ancient Middle East. Over here we have Turkey. Up here would be like the Ukraine and Russia. Down here you see the Tigris and Euphrates River. So this would be Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan. This is the Persian Gulf, Caspian Sea, the Black Sea, Mediterranean Sea. This is Egypt with the Nile River down here, the Red Sea. This is like Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and Yemen and all that stuff down there. And then this is Israel. This is where we're going to be spending most of our time. And then modern day like Jordan and Syria would be up here. So let's talk about this little patch of green here. You'll notice most of this is desert. And so when people wanted to travel through here in the ancient world, they would travel along what's called the Fertile Crescent route. And this is where a lot of towns were. This is where a lot of trade routes were. And this was a really important area because if you notice, over here is Asia, over here is Europe, over here is Africa. This is the intersection of 3 continents. So it was very valuable land. And because of that, there's been a lot of violence there. Even to the modern day, there's still a lot of violence there. And that area has been fought over a lot. So, and it's because there's this little tiny patch of fertile, safe land with like food and water that you can travel through to connect yourself to these 3 continents. So it was very heavily traveled as a very important area. And right in the middle of it is our little old friend Israel right there. Now, the land gets called a lot of different names. Sometimes this is a zoom in. This is a close up of this area right here. You can see the Dead Sea right there. And this is the Dead Sea. This is the Sea of Galilee. The Jordan River goes like this. And so Jesus was from up here. So that's why this area is so important, because it is the intersection of 3 continents. It goes through a lot of different name changes. So it gets called the land of Canaan in the beginning, and then the land of Israel, and sometimes Israel and Judah. The northern part is more Israel, the southern part is more Judah, and eventually it's going to come to be called Palestine by the Romans. But all those names refer to the same place geographically. They're just used at different times. So whenever you hear all those names, they're all referring to the same place. Same with these names of the people. In the early days, God's people called themselves the Hebrews. Later on, they're going to call themselves the Israelites. Later on, they're going to call themselves the Jews. But it's kind of as the people evolves, what they call themselves evolves too. So the first event is that Abraham migrates from Ur in Mesopotamia down here to Canaan, and he follows the Fertile Crescent route. You'll see right there. This is in Genesis 12. You'll notice this is about 2,000 years before Jesus, which means it's about 4,000 years before us. Which means when we think about how old Jesus is, that's how old Abraham seemed to Jesus. Now, Abraham gets there, and they end up migrating to Egypt, and you read about this in the story of Joseph, to escape a famine, a shortage of food. But once they get to Egypt, over time they become enslaved by the Egyptians, which means Moses needs to come and free them, and this is the story of the Exodus. So Moses comes and leads the Hebrews out of Egypt to Mount Sinai, where they receive the Torah, the law, the 10 Commandments. You can read about this in the book of Exodus, and they establish a covenant at Mount Sinai. So you can see them going from Egypt, wandering around the Sinai desert, going to Mount Sinai. We're not exactly sure where Mount Sinai is. And then they end up in a place called the Trans-Jordan region, which just means that they end up near the Jordan River, but they don't actually cross it yet. Anyway, after wandering in the desert for 40 years. This is about 1,200 years before Jesus. About 1,200 years before us, that would be like a little before King Arthur. So if you think about how old that was, that's how old Moses was to Jesus. Now, Joshua is actually going to lead the Hebrews across the Jordan River to actually occupy the land of Canaan. He pulls a Moses, and that's how they get across the Jordan River. You can read about this in the stories of Joshua in the book of Judges. The story of Jericho is part of this, and they conquer promised land, and they kill a lot of people. It's probably the most violent book in the Bible, the book of Joshua. We'll talk about that when we get there. So then they live, after they conquer the promised land, they live as a group of tribes, kind of like the Americans used to live as 13 colonies before we were united. They live as they live as 12 tribes who are ruled by tribal leaders called judges. Like Samson's the most famous of the judges. Also Deborah and Gideon are famous ones that we're going to look at. But then the Philistines invade from the sea, this group of kind of pirate seafarers, the sea peoples that they call the Philistines invade, and that pressure on those 12 tribes makes them unite under a king named Saul, who turns out to be a really terrible king who's really paranoid and insecure, and he is, after he dies, his throne is taken over by one of their war heroes, a guy named David, who's generally regarded as the best king, the most famous king, which is why Jesus is called like Son of David and that sort of thing. And so he's known for killing Goliath, and he expands the kingdom. This is like the golden age of Israel, is during King David's rule. And then after David, one of his sons, Solomon, who's known for his wisdom, reigns, although his wisdom kind of gets less as he gets older, and he overtaxes the northern part of Israel, and the north revolts after he dies, causing. He also builds the temple, which is a big deal. But in his later days, he overtaxes the northern part of the kingdom, which revolts after he dies, and there's a civil war, and the kingdom splits into two. And the northern kingdom, whose capital is Samaria, is now called Israel, and the southern kingdom, whose capital is Jerusalem, is now called Judah. And this is part of why the Samaritans and the Jews didn't get along in Jesus' time, which is why it's such a big deal when Jesus tells a story about a good Samaritan, because they didn't think that the Samaritans were very good, but the Jews didn't. They weren't supposed to talk to each other. Okay, but then the weakened, split empire gets conquered by the Assyrians. The Assyrians come in and destroy the northern empire. So this is the Assyrian empire here. You'll notice it follows the Fertile Crescent route because nobody wants to live in the desert. So they come and conquer the northern kingdom. The Assyrians are going to intermarry with the northern Israelites and the Samaritans, and they kind of have a hybrid religion of worship. The Samaritans end up kind of worshiping some of the Assyrian gods and also Yahweh, so that's another reason why the Jews and the Samaritans in Jesus' time don't like each other, is because the Jews feel like the Samaritans have abandoned their role as God's people and joined with the Assyrians. This is the beginning of the age of the prophets. The northern kingdom of Israel is wiped out. Judah becomes a vassal of the Assyrians, meaning that they don't get conquered, but they have to pay a whole lot of taxes to the Assyrians to not be conquered. But then the Babylonians come along. The Babylonians are the baddest dudes in the Old Testament. Again, see, their kingdom follows the Fertile Crescent because nobody wants to live in the desert. But they conquer the southern kingdom, and this, for the Jews in the Old Testament, this is like the worst thing that ever happens to them. All the really sad, terrible, depressing stuff in the Old Testament, it's all about this time. The whole book of Lamentations, a lot of the Psalms that are really sad, a lot of them are written about this time. And a lot of stories about why things are bad in the Bible come from this time too, like the Tower of Babel. It's about the Babylonians. They make the Babylonians the bad guys. So anyway, and after this time, this is when people are called the Jews. The Babylonians also destroy the temple and a lot of Jerusalem, which makes them very unpopular with the Jews. And then they're going to take most of the leaders of Judah, the kings and the priests and the richer educated people, and take them off to exile in Babylon, the prophets, etc., and they leave behind like the poor, uneducated farmers. So we don't really know what happens in Judah during the Babylonian exile, because the Babylonians took all the people that could read and write to Babylon. But fortunately, there's a group called the Persians, led by a guy named Cyrus, who comes through and kicks the Babylonians' butts, and he's a lot nicer than the Babylonians were, and so he lets the Jews return from exile back home. You'll notice again, they follow the Fertile Crescent route. Their empire does not go into the desert. The Persians get a bad rap from movies like the 300, but in terms of people you wanted to be conquered by in the ancient world, if you had to pick one, the Persians were not a bad people to pick. So they conquer Babylon, and they let the Jews return from exile. And so the Jews do come back from exile, and this is called the period of the Restoration, when they live under Persian rule pretty peacefully, and they rebuild their temple. You can read about this in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. But then this dude named Alexander the Great comes on the scene, and the Persians push a little too far, and they attack Greece, and the Greeks kick their butts. Alexander's sent to knock them back, and he ends up taking over their whole empire, and then some goes all the way to India, all the way down into Egypt. Again, you'll notice the Fertile Crescent route. Still nobody wants to conquer the desert. And Alexander starts to really push Greek culture. And that process of pushing Greek culture is called Hellenization. It's like Greekification, basically. And they push Greek culture, Greek religion, Greek philosophy. They pressure people to worship the Greek gods and speak the Greek language. This is why the New Testament gets written in Greek. This is why the Old Testament gets translated into Greek, and that's called the Septuagint. Remember we talked about that last unit? It's the Old Testament translation of it's the translation into Greek of the Old Testament. That's Plato and Aristotle, by the way. Greek philosophers. And then there's a Greek Roman named Antiochus IV who is also doing Hellenization after Alexander, and he really steps up the persecution of the Jewish religion. In the book of Maccabees, you can read about terrible things that the Greeks did to the Jews, and like there's this one story about they kill off 7 brothers and their mother because they wouldn't worship the Greek gods. So anyway, pretty bad stuff the Greeks did. The Greeks are the bad guys in the Bible. I know we don't really think of them as the good guys, but the Persians are more the good guys in the Bible. So the Jews get so mad that they actually revolt against the Greeks, and they're led by a family named the Maccabees. And the Maccabees, which you can read about in the books of 1st and 2nd Maccabees, win the war, and they kick out the Greeks. And for a short time, the Jews are independent again for the first time in like 400 or 500 years since before the Assyrians and the Babylonians. So they're free until this group. Oh, by the way, before we get to number 20, the story of Hanukkah comes from this period. You can read about it in the books of Maccabees. It's about their revolt against the Greeks. And then the Romans come through and they take over Palestine. This area is called Palestine now. And again, you'll notice the Fertile Crescent right there. Still nobody wants to live in the desert. And this guy Julius Caesar comes through and conquers everything and basically makes the Mediterranean Sea a big Roman lake. And they're still in control at the time of Jesus. Now, so this is about 63 years before Jesus that they take over. Now, after Jesus, the Jews are going to revolt against the Jews, and as punishment, the Romans are going to destroy the temple, which is like a really terrible, awful thing that you can read about in parts of the New Testament. And then again, about 60 years later, they're going to rebel. The Jews are going to rebel against the Romans again, and the Romans are going to get really mad this time, come through, kill a lot of Jews, burn the whole city of Jerusalem, and a lot of Jews scatter and leave Israel after that and spread all over the place. And then Israel as a country is not reestablished until 1947. It's ruled by the Romans for a while, and then by the Byzantine Empire when the Roman Empire splits, and then various Muslim empires will rule it, and then the Crusaders come through, and various Christian empires will rule it, and then the various Muslim empires will rule it again until the British take over in World War I, and then after World War II, they'll give an independence. And so for about 2,000 years, Israel is not independent. So those are the 20 key events of Old Testament history. We're going to walk through all of those over the next few months. But for right now, I just want you to be able to put them in order. So make your flashcards. On the front, I just want you to put the number, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And on the back, put the name of the event. Don't put the date, because that will defeat the point of you memorizing them. And then I want you to practice shuffling up your cards and putting them in order. Shuffling up your cards and putting them in order. And then you'll be very well prepared for your quiz. Good luck.